I know it's a little cloudy outside, but that's okay. We are alive and kicking, and we're going to have a great show today. We have an awesome guest. This is Onward, and I'm your host, Adrianne Hamilton Butler. Welcome. You are listening to us on the new WCEG Network. You can live stream us right now on WCEGTalkRadio.com. You can also see us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. We are the worldwide community empowerment group where we speak life into the community. I invite you to also check us out on our new app. We are on Apple and Android platforms. So check us out. You can see us on, and I'm new at this with the app. So, it's WCEG Talk Radio. So would love for you to download that. And as always, the opinions and views expressed this morning are those of the host and guest, not of WCEG. So now to the fun part. I want to introduce a friend, my special friend, as well as the founder of StoryMuse. That's Shannon Turner. Welcome, Shannon.
Hi, everyone.
So Shannon is what I call a master storyteller. I met Shannon a couple of years ago when she did an event with Men Stopping Violence called Trigger Warning. It was pretty amazing. Shannon was able to bring together some folks to talk about stories of trauma. And so before I get to StoryMuse, I want to talk to you, Shannon, a little bit about what got you into storytelling. What is it that compelled you to see that this was really a viable way of getting people to open up and to express the things that are happening in their lives?
Well, first, let me just say thank you very much, Adrianne, for inviting me to be on your show. You know, I think the world of you and all the work that you do. So I often joke that as a storyteller, you can start and end a story anywhere. It all just comes down to the editing. And in fact, that can make the difference between a happy story and a sad story, you know? So when I talk about how I got into storytelling, I could go all the way back to growing up in the hills of Tennessee in the shadow of what is now the International Storytelling Center. And they would send out professional storytellers to our schools. And I had a little storytelling club, and we got to tell stories back to these big professional storytellers, which was very inspiring and humbling. In going to camp and how I would learn the stories that the camp counselors were teaching, and I would tell those stories back to us. And moving forward, storytelling always stayed there in the background for me. I really loved the opportunity. I also did some theater, so I was a little bit of a stage hog. You know, I have a friend who says that her biggest addiction is applause. And that resonated with me. But I got all of those messages that, you know, it's not really viable to be a full-time artist and support yourself, especially as a single person. I just didn't really feel like I could take that risk. In 2010, a version of the Moth came to Atlanta before we had the formal Moth here. It was called Moth Up, and it was an informal gathering at Manuel's Tavern. After about a year, it decided to go independent from the Moth because there were things with the structure of the Moth that just didn't work for how we were operating, and became carapace, which is like the hard outer shell of a turtle or a crustacean. So kind of the invitation implicitly to come out of your shell.
Right.
I was the first person on the first night, all the way back on that night in 2010, to have her name pulled out of the hat. And that always felt like a kind of auspicious turning of my life, you know, toward this direction. Yeah. And because of my theater background, I started getting opportunities to direct others, to coach them, and put together shows. And then in 2016, I just finally had a bit of a wake-up call, and it was actually in the wake of the presidential election, which everyone kept saying was so surprising to everyone. Right. And they said that the reason why it was so surprising is because we operate in these silos of sameness. We don't hear each other across lines of difference. Exactly. And I just felt like that's the one thing I can do, is help us hear each other. So I left my job with 6 weeks notice and $4,000 in the bank, and I've never looked back. Well, I've had some hard times. I mean, it was not easy. You know, they say you should like save up 6 months of income before you start your own thing,
Right.
all of that. So it was pretty lean couple of years there at the beginning, but now I'm so happy, and especially because of all the opportunities I have to work with other people on their stories.
So, the thing about storytelling is a lot of times, we divulge those things that are really private. Some of them can be traumatic. And the thing about StoryMuse and the thing about you is that you help people to deliver their story in a way that's both transformative for them, but can also be transformative for others. Why is there this way of delivery? Why can't I just go out and say, you know what, this is my story, I'm just going to tell it?
Well, it starts with the invitation. I think a lot of people don't feel that opportunity to just go out and tell their story. I think for me, a lot of the work is about cultivating and holding space where people feel safe to say that. And in terms of that connection that happens, one of my favorite quotes about the storytelling field is, the shortest distance between two human hearts is a story. And there's beautiful neuroscience that talks about how when a person is telling a story, the person who's listening, their brain waves start to sync up after a while. So there is like some really deep, beautiful human biology behind the act of storytelling. And I think sometimes my work is hard because of, the invitation to people to tell some of their hardest stories. I mean, that was the show that you came to, Trigger Warning. I actually had a vision of that because I had been at Virginia Tech when the shootings happened there. And I went back and I did a lot of work in the community just right when it happened, and then 10 years later. And I was visiting with a friend who was, asking me about this new life that I was cultivating as a storyteller. And I told her about the work at Virginia Tech. And then just out of the blue, she started telling me about how she had been pistol whipped in her front yard in Grant Park. And I felt convicted that here I was still like traveling back to my former community and talking about this large global traumatic event, which at the time felt like the largest shooting we would ever have. Now we have one 3 times a day, which is always heartbreaking to me. But I hadn't thought about what my obligation might be to help people in my now community, and especially to hold space for stories of everyday trauma and violence. And so that's where Trigger Warning was born. So that was my first major self-producing show.
So I want to talk a little bit about something you said, creating this safe space for people to even tell their story. And that's so important because when people share those things that are most vulnerable, sometimes the response can be a little harsh. People can judge, people can minimize. Talk a little bit about what it means to create a safe space for a person who's opening up and telling their story.
Well, I mean, I think what you're talking about is especially a real phenomenon that happens like in social media and other places where people tend to sort of do a lot of divulging. But the thing is, that's mixed in amongst, people's vacation pictures and ads for, pillows or who knows what else. So I feel like sometimes people feel a little taken aback by that kind of vulnerability because maybe that's not what they're there for. Right. Whereas in an event space or a healing space where you're bringing people together, you got to hope that someone who walks through the door knows that that's what they're there for. I mean, even like putting in the title Trigger Warning, like you got to know that this is going to be a deep show. Right. So I think it starts with that, but it's also sometimes about what you do when you're like holding that space in terms of how you MC the show or even the environment as people walk in. A lot of times I really like to have a, meal sharing opportunity before a show starts. So with Trigger Warning, one of my favorite things that we did is we asked people to write a secret on.
Yes, I remember that.
And
that was powerful.
So we shared their secrets in between other stories. And that was interesting because I got to tell you, some people wrote some very
they did. Yes.
In there, and some of them I didn't even read. Some of them were kind of amazing. Like I had an affair with my husband's brother and no one knows, it's like, wow, I can't believe you were brave enough to put that on a piece of paper. But yeah, I think it is about how you cultivate an environment around it. And also, a lot of it has to do with how I coach people. So even though some of the work that I do is about telling hard stories, I always encourage people that they don't have to tell their hardest story. They just need to tell the story that they feel like they're there to tell. So when I've worked with girls who were sex trafficked, sometimes they would choose to tell a story about the grandmother who would refuse to throw them a birthday party, or how much they hate pepperoni on pizza. Like they did not have to go there. And I think that was okay, because at the end of the day, the therapeutic opportunity is about just learning how to tell a story, how you organize it and deliver it, and then have that moment of pride when you get that audience reaction.
And you mentioned the word healing, right? And so a lot of times people think that in storytelling, the healing comes from telling that thing, like you were saying, that's the most traumatic, when really it's one, having the courage to even tell any part of your life. And two, it's the things that we hold on to. That most traumatic thing might not be that thing that we're really holding on to that's deep in our heart. It could be, like you said, how grandma didn't throw the party, or that thing that we really love that no one knows about us, that really humanizes us, right?
Absolutely. So vulnerability is a word that is very contentious. Many people see that word in different ways. And I have for a long time had a curriculum. Actually, I teach people how to build their stories by comparing it to a sandwich. So I call it the story sandwich, and so I call vulnerability the cheese of your sandwich, because I don't ever want to eat a sandwich that doesn't have cheese on it. But I also talk about how vulnerability is kind of like exfoliating. I can tell you exfoliate because you have this beautiful glowing skin. But I talk about how, like, if you over exfoliate, then you become raw and open to infection, like you've scrubbed off too much of your protection. But if you never exfoliate, then your skin can become dull or lifeless. And so that's how you have to find the right balance of vulnerability in your storytelling. Like, you need to give a little bit of of yourself away. And that's the whole thing. It's about trust and authenticity. And you've probably seen a person who's tried to tell a story and like not reveal the real details or talk about the story. That is, there's not enough vulnerability. But then you've also probably seen someone who's just like vomited it all out on the stage, you feel like they should be paying you for therapy, and that's too much vulnerability. So it's about striking the balance where you feel like you're being brave,
right,
but you're not floodlighting, as Brene Brown calls it.
No, and I think that's a really good point. And I like the whole, kind of exfoliating analogy, because you're right. If you share too much, you're raw. And what happens when you're raw is that, you feel even more vulnerable. Right. And so talk a little bit about how StoryMuse came about some of the things that you do at StoryMuse, because you do some one-on-one coaching, but you also do workshops with different organizations and companies, as well as residencies. So talk a little bit about those three different aspects of StoryMuse.
Well, I really find that it's an ecology where, the work all feeds itself. And it's kind of beautiful, because trigger warning led to that project I was mentioning that I did with girls who'd been sex trafficked, which then led to another project. And I don't do a lot of hardcore marketing, because I have this beautiful word of mouth network where people learn about it. And the challenge, though, is that, if you were looking for a lawyer or an accountant, you would know what that service is, and you're just trying to decide who is the best fit for you. Whereas for me, I feel like a lot of the marketing is really about educating people about the service, why you would want it, how you could use it, and then convince them that I'm the right person. So it's a lot of like throwing child tracks in front of the train. But yeah, some of my favorite work does have to do with working with these special populations. So I've worked with, I mentioned that other project, but also I've worked a lot with people with disabilities, and that's an advocacy project, and also people who are building their way out of being unhoused. And then, of course, a lot of real estate agents and academics and clergy in between, because I like to say there's no one who doesn't need to tell a good story,
Right, exactly. And I think that's what's interesting is a lot of times, like you were talking about special populations. So that would be a lot of the nonprofits that work with those populations. But you're right in that there are a lot of people who don't believe that they really have a story to tell because life has been good for them. They haven't had what they perceive to be the trauma that maybe someone who was experiencing homelessness or someone with a disability. Talk a little bit about that, because I think sometimes we kind of hide. You talked about carapace, right? And that shell, coming out of that shell. I think that there are a lot of us living in shells. Talk about some of the difficulties that you have with people or organizations where they don't want to come out of the shell. They don't want to share their story because frankly, they don't think they have one to tell.
Yeah. So the core of my work most of the time involves getting people to draw a life map. And I have all these beautiful pictures, if you go to my website, of these like stick figure drawings, or, the back of somebody as they're standing against a wall with an easel piece of paper. And I so enjoy that part, even though I myself I don't consider myself to be a visual artist. I'm constantly making people draw. And it is so fun to see like a businessman in his suit, like take off his jacket and roll up his sleeves and get down on a piece of paper and draw his life out. And there's something that's so humbling about that, especially because I write it off. And when I'm introducing this activity, I say, I want you to go back to your 5-year-old self. Self that had no judgment over what they would draw and loved getting the 36 pack of Crayola crayons with the little sharpener in the back, and would just express. So I often think about that like real estate agent workshop in conjunction with the workshop that I would do with a group of people who are building their way out of being unhoused. Because at the end of the day, we're all still 5-year-olds who are eager and have beautiful stories, but damaged and afraid and all of those things. And then after we've gone through that life map process, we put the maps up on the wall and we walk around and have a gallery in silence as people look at each other's stories.
I love that.
And it's just always so beautiful and holy to, see people like look at these pictures from often it's a colleague or, someone they've been in relation to in some way before, and start to I wonder what that, picture of a car means. And I always, speaking of cars, when I do that, I always have this flash of thinking about myself sitting in Atlanta traffic when someone cuts me off and how I want to show them some part of my hand. And I just wish that, our life maps could become revealed to each other,
Right.
like those cartoon thought bubbles.
Right.
Because I feel like we would have so much more empathy for each other in those times.
I agree with you. I do think that, we don't know what other people are going through. Some of the trauma they've experienced, even that morning, even in the past, that still impacts them. And that leads me to one of the things I had really wanted to talk to you about. We talked a little bit about it a couple of days ago, and that's your project, Walk with Grief. And I know that it's on hiatus right now. But I think that's important because Onward, this show is really about how do we move on from those things that are, unexpected, uncertain, unwanted. And so there's a healing with that. There's a healing with the walking. There's a healing with telling the story. Talk a little bit about why you started that project.
Certainly. Well, I've, had a number of things that have happened in my life that were part of what led up to my choice to become a storyteller. My uncle died of AIDS in Atlanta here when I was in college in Virginia he passed from this earth without being able to tell anybody in our family that he was dying. And that was really hard. And it felt like it changed who I was fundamentally, that just the notion that he would feel like he had to hide. I had an aunt who had a traumatic brain injury as a child, which left her with an intellectual disability. And I was her travel partner, late in life. And then the shootings at Virginia Tech, and just like there's lots of things that happened along the way that led me to feel like I was a person who carried a lot of grief in my body.
Yeah.
Then I took on this amazing storytelling work, and some of the work I do has a lot of grief embedded in it as well. So, for instance, I did this beautiful project with Chris 180 with their teen drop-in center for young people, most of whom are queer or trans, because that's how a lot of our young people become homeless. They either run away or they're kicked out of their homes.
Right.
And so we did a pop-up drive-in theater right in the middle of the pandemic. And it was so amazing and revelatory. But after a while, I realized I felt like I was sort of accumulating these striated labors of grief from the work. And the one thing I know is best for me is to walk. It's good for your health, but it's also good for your mental health. And I often walk with another person one-on-one as a way to connect with each other. So one day I was taking a shower, and that term "walks with grief" just flitted through my mind. And I thought about how walking is my best strategy for getting through grief. And just sort of kind of came about that I was imagining doing like a memoir that also had this layer of talking about how walking, and I was going to look at grief ceremonies and how other cultures deal with grief, whether it's sitting Shiva or like these beautiful things. I wanted to look at ritual as a way, non-religious in particular, because I think some people feel sort of disconnected from traditional religion at this point. And so I actually even took a book sabbatical at one point after I had been doing StoryMuse for 5 years, and I felt a little burnt out, and I was ready to sort of try to invest in my own creativity. And so I wrote for about 5 months, and I had about 150 pages, and I was still taking lots. I even had public walking and writing events where we would walk for a while, and then I would sit and read, or people would read to each other, and they'd have a chance to journal. Those were really fun and beautiful. But when I got to the point where I was starting to send my material to friends or colleagues to get them to read it, they had questions like, who's your audience for this? Or what do you feel like you're trying to say? And I couldn't answer those questions. I felt like, oh, this book might be kind of a mess. And so I've decided for now that I'm not going to keep sort of knocking my head up against the wall until I can answer some of those core questions that most people start with when they're writing a book. Then I'm just going to let it lie fallow. And there's some grief in that, but there's also some joy in saying it wasn't a failure. It was just an experiment.
Right. But I think there's a lot that you learn from this experience, especially things that people shared with you. And a lot of times when we think of grief, we think of the physical loss of someone. But there's grief that comes with losing your job, grief that comes with divorce, grief with growing older. I'm looking at my parents, my father, whose memory is starting to fade. There's grief with that because he knows that his memory is fading. What were some of the things that surprised you as you were walking with people and they were sharing their grief?
I think one of the things that's beautiful about the walk as a way to sort of engage in our grief is that you don't always have to express it the way that I encourage people to do in storytelling. You're kind of pounding that out into the earth and letting it go back, let it become kind of compost for the earth to make beautiful things out of. So sometimes people didn't necessarily share whatever their grief was, but you could tell at the end that there was still this deeper connection with each other as we would stand in a circle at the end, and that just this lightness and the breathing and the way we look each other in the eye. So I think that maybe that's one of the things that's interesting about pairing the notion of walking with storytelling is it's similar in how it moves things out and through our bodies, but very different expression.
I like that because, there's that whole phrase of walking alongside people, right? In a variety of ways. And I think the whole notion of walking alongside people is just being present. I'm amazed because I would see my sons and husband together and there's silence. But at the end, I would say, well, did you enjoy being with each other? And they were like, yeah. And it was because they were in that same space together. And like you said, their energy would start pairing up. And so I like that whole idea of walking with someone as they're probably not even saying anything, but still releasing that grief. And so you've kind of put that on the back burner, but you still have StoryMuse and you have Carapace, which I think is really interesting for people who are interested in telling their story. Tell us a little bit about Carapace and what it is, where it is, how often, and kind of how people can get involved.
Certainly. So that's one of the beautiful turnings in my life that I mentioned. So I, originally just came as an audience participant, was that first person on the first night, but was always a faithful attendee. I went, I jokingly called it Story Church because it was like the one place you could always know you would find me. And the people, Randy and Joyce, who founded it, they worked ably and beautifully with the community for many years to produce Carapace. And so it's the fourth Tuesday of the month at Manuel's Tavern, which is, this wonderful linchpin of our community, a historic place. And every month there's a theme. So last month's theme was awkward. This month's theme is curious. And that theme just sort of like creates a little bit of a boundary to help people figure out what their story is going to be. And there's a timer, 5 to 7 minutes. You just, if you're interested because of that theme, you throw your name in the hat. And then if your name gets pulled, then you get up. And we have a few rules, like no notes, no political rants, no comedy routines or singing. This is not like an open mic in that way. It is very focused on personal stories. And we right up until we celebrated our 10th anniversary, February 2020. And what happened right after that? So the organization took a hiatus that turned out to be a bit long. I think a lot of people started coming back for things in person by 2021, but we just weren't quite ready, especially because there are some older folks who participate. And also because of the fact that we meet at Manuel's, most people feel like they need to eat or drink to support them.
Right.
So we finally came back in June of 2022. And at that point, the organizers, they've had some big life changes. And so they invited me to take over running it. And so now I'm the producer of this thing that was such an important part of my life for so long.
That is awesome.
And it is a broad swath of the community that comes out for this in terms of age, race, all the different demographics. And it's just so beautiful to sit, elbow to elbow with strangers and hear people tell these stories. Some of them are funny, some of them are, and that's the best thing about the 5 to 7 minute time limit. If you're not enjoying the story, just wait till the next one. Yeah.
So I just want to take a quick break to say that again, you're listening to Onward on the new WCEG Network. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and not Instagram anymore. But we do have an app and you can download that app. Look for us on WCEG Talk Radio. Also, I'm with Shannon Turner of StoryMuse. Shannon, tell us the website for StoryMuse and how folks can contact you.
It's storymuse.net. And then I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. A lot of those have StoryMuse, and that's StoryMuse.
And so, you said something interesting when you were talking about telling the stories and kind of doing that, story map. And you talked about having people go back to their 5-year-old selves. And so one of the things I always do on the show is I always ask people to tell us a little bit about their 18-year-old self. Because there's always this kind of big transition that happens, especially for those of us who are a little older. But the 18-year-old Shannon, I'm sure, was a lot different than the now Shannon. There's a lot that happened in between to shape you, but Tell us a little bit about that 18-year-old Shannon.
Oh, I love this question. And, one of the things I find, especially about the, things like Carapace, where people can tell a story about themselves that, is not directed by me saying we have this particular outcome we're looking for, is a lot of our stories come from that period of our lives. And
Yes.
there's a brilliant researcher at Emory who is looking at the neurobiology of that and how it's a transition point in our brains as we move toward that, 25-year-old mark where our brains stop changing. But I think because some people go to college or they, start their first jobs or a trade school or they move out of the house, like there's just like some fundamental reasons why those stories come from that time. A lot of times people travel during then. So like there's always great stories about something different that happened in your life at that point. My 18-year-old self was very naive and hyper romantic. I went to a small liberal arts college in Southwest Virginia. It was only about an hour away from home. It was in the family business to do that because it was a Methodist school.
Okay.
And I did not fare well my first year in terms of like the sociology of it. I did get into plays, which was fun, but I had a hard time. I had a roommate who drank like a sailor, smoked like a sailor, cuss like a sailor. And we did not get along very well. And I found myself having a hard time through that sort of semi-bullying situation. But then through, being able to do plays and getting out and knowing other friends. And that was also right about the time. So my uncle died when I was 19. So that was a huge transition to me becoming sort of more of a social justice oriented person.
Yes.
I made a pact with myself that I wasn't going to hide who I was from my family. And I think a lot of things came out from that, but I will never forget, like, a friend of mine from high school came to visit when I was in my first year of college, and I had this like crush on him. I was so hoping we would walk through the leaves and kick them and, all the, things that commercials and rom-coms and everything had taught me I should look for. And now I'm kind of jaded where that stuff is concerned. And I just have so much compassion for that me who was looking for the movie of her life to start, And
I think you're right. The reason I go back to 18, and it's interesting that you talked about the studies around that age, is because I think that's when the awareness of who you are really kind of begins. There's that spark of, oh, I'm a person and I have feelings. And I mean, you've had them all along, but there's all of a sudden this you kind of look backwards and then you start looking forward at what you could possibly become. And you're able to communicate that. But what's interesting is you said something to me a couple of days ago. We talked a little bit about it, and I want to kind of capture it. But you talked about how we get educated out of our power. Because within us is the ability to tell our story, and that story has power. But we get educated out of it. Talk a little bit about what you meant by that, Shannon.
So I'll start with a little bit of a thought experiment for you, Adrianne. If I were going to ask you to get up and tell a 5 to 7 minute story, what would be the first thing you would do to start preparing for that?
Start going back in my mind and thinking about what story I want to tell.
Yeah. But then what would you start to write it down? Would you write it out?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this is also a brain science thing. There's literal neurological science, but you probably heard about right brain versus left brain.
Yes.
And so our written language lives on one side of our brain, and our oral, our lived experiences, live on the other side. So if you write your story out word for word, it becomes a script that you have to work twice as hard.
Oh, yeah.
And especially because I'm not, training people to tell historic stories or something from mythology. It's your own lived experience. And so I always think about that person who was damaged by school. And I always think of them as being like the 5th grader standing with a shaky paper in their hand, trying to deliver the book report. But your story, you can't get it wrong. In fact, it It says that in my
I love that.
brochure. It's your story.
Yes,
You can't get it
it's your
wrong.
story. Can't get it wrong. I love that. I absolutely love that.
And there's
Yeah,
so many things about the way our education system is unfortunately structured at the moment that teaches people that their core is somehow wrong. So
right.
I feel like half the work I do is helping people sort of unpack those layers and get back to the part of themselves that can powerfully stand and deliver a story.
Right, right. No, I like that. And it's kind of interesting how we do write a script for our own story, as if there's a way that we're supposed to say it.
Right. But it's not just that, Adrianne. I feel like we have all these scripts in our minds, which are sometimes helpful and sometimes not. I feel like one of the best things that I do is to help people sort of try to go along a trajectory from being the hapless victim of their stories to becoming the hero of their stories, and then stepping out of the narrative altogether and becoming the powerful narrator of their story.
I love what you just said, for a lot of different reasons. I mean, you know that I work in the homelessness space,
Mhm.
and a lot of times, people that we work with, they want to be the heroes of their own story, but they're kind of trapped into this kind of what has happened to me, and that's who I am, is what has happened to me, not this life that can be created moving forward.
Right. It's like it becomes this story that you continue to make true, that you manifest because you of
Exactly.
the person that you think that you are, or people have told you. And the
Exactly.
first time this really woke me up, and I use this analogy of have you ever heard that joke about the young fish run into the old fish, and the old fish says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the young fish say, "What's water?" Um, I think of
Oh,
that in terms of storytelling
right.
because we um we don't see that story is all around us. I mean, certainly we're becoming more aware of like the power of capitalism to tell us certain kinds of
Yes.
stories, like to tell us we need to buy things, or, who we are in that way. But I feel like the more flexible and fluid and powerful you get with your own stories, the more you can change that narrative.
Exactly.
And it's so I was going to say, I had this amazing mentor when I was about a bit younger, and she's passed from this earth, but she was a master storyteller, and she wrote books about it and would be hired to come and make community plays. And when Carapace was first starting, I would write out my stories and I would send them to her. And she said two things that have always stuck with me. One was about this brain science thing. And she was like, you're going to have to decide how you're going to give a story away. Are you going to give it away by writing, or are you going to give it away by telling it?
Telling it, right.
The second thing, what relates to what we're talking about right now, is she said, Turner, she had this good old Tennessee, way about her. She said, Turner, I'm going to need you to tell a better story. I'm going to need you to stop always being the person who's like dropping it, breaking it, falling over it and waiting for her life to happen. Now, I still encourage people to tell the stories about how you dropped it, fell over it, whatever.
Yes.
But then what you learn from it, and I think that's the key piece that a lot of people are missing when they tell a story, is like the so what,
Right. Exactly. Yes. It's so funny because I've been working on a written book for forever. And the thing I always say is like, so what? What's behind this? Why? What's the what behind it? And so I love that you say that even in storytelling, it's the so what.
Yeah, and the change. Oh, so one of the best things about storytelling to me is that a story is not a story unless some change occurs.
Exactly. Right.
It's just an anecdote if you're just like, oh, this one time in college, I put my foot down a hole,
Right.
But if
What
you
happened? Right.
take to tell about the change, then every time you tell a story, you're creating an act of change. So you're like in a
Exactly.
micro way bringing change to the world. So I always say, what great story starts with everything was always okay, and then moves on to, and I was always really good at it, and then ends with, and so nothing changed.
So nothing changed. Exactly. And I think that's the thing that does really make it a story for us. It's impactful because it transformed something within us,
Mhm.
whether it was for good or for not.
Yeah.
And so what I think 3 things would you want to leave people with is they're listening and thinking about telling their own story. What 3 things would you want people to consider?
Um, so one thing I'll say is that in order to become a better storyteller, you have to become a better story listener. And I think that that is true for not just storytelling, but for life. I mean, we
Yeah,
live in a distraction machine, it's just not getting any better. But
right.
I'll never forget the first time I really paid attention to this. I was, so my dad was a minister, and we would most of the time ride the bus home, but every once in a while he would pick us up, and his day wouldn't be done. So we would go with him as he would go to visit shut-ins, people in the hospital. And he would sit there for, about 40, 45 minutes and listen as people would talk about their pain, their families, their lives. And then
Right.
eventually he would sit forward and he'd put his hands on his knees and he'd say, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then he'd stand up, uh-huh. And then he'd start inching his way toward the door and he'd start walking, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then finally he'd say, well, let's say a prayer. And one day it finally dawned on me, this dude's not been listening for the
Listening,
last 15
right.
minutes. Like his mind's out the door and in the truck and down the street at the grocery store, and it was his job to listen. So I think we are in a world now where we're constantly either we have the 27 tabs open behind our eyes,
Yes.
and so we're constantly toggling, or, if you find yourself in the rare opportunity to really engage with a person, you're like, oh, I'm so hungry. What's that smell? I got to feed the kids. What's my next meeting? Or you're thinking about what you're going to say next.
Exactly.
So you're
Yes.
not actually hearing people. So one of my core parts of the work is I do a deep listening exercise with people. And then I talk about how when I stopped throwing my name in the hat every month at Carapace, I became a much better storyteller because I was able to become a connoisseur of story, not just my stories, but of how people construct their stories. What are their themes? There's this one guy at Carapace who is hilarious, and he uses his hands all, in all these beautiful articulate ways, and I learned from that. I picked that up. So I feel like story listening and,
Yes.
there's all kinds of places that you can learn, hear people tell stories is a really deep, important thing. One of the things I talk about is just the power of the first and the last line. And that's the bread on your sandwich, your story sandwich, that holds it all together. So even though I encourage people not to write their story out word for word, I do encourage people to really plan and nail that first and last line.
Okay.
Because the first line sort of like, it helps us step across that liminal space from everyday conversation to,
Yes.
I'm talking now and what I think is important, and I want you to think it's important. So here we go,
Yes.
So a great opening line can help with that. And then the same with the closing line. And that is the thing I think people particularly forget to do. And it's the thing where we sum it all up that so what, the moral of your story is often in that last line. But sometimes people get there and we're not used to holding that power for so long. And you can often sort of see it start to drain out of their bodies.
Yes.
And they get all like fumbly and weird and say things like, well, I guess that's all my story, like Forrest Gump. That's all I got to say about that. So I really encourage people to find that last line, know it, nail it, and then almost be like the gymnast who tumbles across the floor and, throws her hands up in the air. No wobble.
Yes, exactly. I love that. And I want to say something really quick about that last line. So I have a habit that a lot of my friends think is really weird, but I always read the back of a book first. Even if I'm thinking about reading it, I go to the back because I really want to know not the end, but I want to know, wow, is this something that I really want to get to? Is there enough here where I really want to know how the author got to that point? And so you're right about the fact that how it ends is very important because a lot of times that's what people remember.
Yeah, and that's so funny, Adrienne. I've never met another human being that did that, but there's
Oh,
this.
you do that too?
I don't know, but that one of my favorite movies is When Harry Met Sally, and he
Yeah.
talks about the fact that he reads the end of the book first, and I mean, it's very dark, and she says this is one of the proofs that you are a dark person, but he does it because he wants to know in case he dies before he ends reading.
Yes. But yeah, it is very rare. I haven't met anyone else who does it. But yeah, and so, we have listening, we have making sure that you have that beginning and that end set up and that you understand it, know it. And what's the last thing?
I think it's something we've already touched on, but maybe we can just remind people to tell yourself a better story. I feel like we should really pay attention to the person that we want to be in the world and how our stories inform or influence those choices. So every morning, like I'm sitting in front of this lovely picture window in my den. Every
Yes.
morning I get up and open the curtains here and I say, what is the story about this day that I want to tell?
Yes.
And I feel like that just kind of goes to the core of who we are as people. But honestly, one of the things that I meant to mention earlier is that I'm becoming so fascinated with how the stories we tell ourselves as individuals have echoes of how we tell ourselves stories as organizations or teams, and then as communities, and then as countries. Like it all sort of like has rippling effects through broader and broader networks and like groups of people. So because I'm sure about communities who've been told a story about what that community is.
Yes, exactly.
And so once we had this power, this transformative potential of storytelling to turn that narrative around, then we can really have some influence.
I like that. So, we have a few minutes left. One of the things I'd love to do is have you, if you don't mind, share a little bit about some of the projects that you're working on, how you are seeing them to transform either people or community, and also then some work that you're open to doing so that people can kind of get a sense of, yeah, let's contact Shannon or StoryMuse.
Yeah, please do. So I mentioned that project that I did with Chris 180 in the heart of the pandemic, and that is just a beautiful thing that happened. We got the grant for that in the before time, and it was conceived very like work that I'd done before, where it was going to happen over the course of a few weeks and be, cumulative performance in a theater. And then when the pandemic descended, we had all these choice points, and the funder was very generous. They said, you can pivot to a virtual or wait till 2021. There's all these different ways that, they were willing to work with us. But the folks at Chris 180's, the spot, were like, yes, absolutely, we can wait. We don't think that this is a population that's going to be able to pivot to virtual.
Okay.
And just so you know, like, they're sitting around not being able to be served in the same way, as the buses are not running. We can't take them to, job interviews. There's like all these things they can't do right now. So if there's a way we can make this project happen during this time, let's please do that. And so we went out and we did a whole other crowdfunding campaign and resource gathering from the community. And we made that project happen outside in 1 week under tents that were donated. And then we filmed their stories. And this wonderful person donated the pop-up screen. And as I realized, so usually when I train people to tell their stories and have these events, that's the thing, they're telling their story on stage, but their stories were filmed. And so I was like, yeah, I could let them sit there and enjoy watching their story as it's happening, or we could use this as another opportunity to engage with the audience. And so everybody, most of them were in their cars. And this was, before we even had vaccines.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This was July 2020. And so we actually ended up giving the storytellers cardboard, and we asked them to make a sign that was in relation to their story. So they're directly addressing that stereotype. You were talking about the stereotypical homeless person.
Yeah.
They were using the media that usually people think of, but they were undoing all of those stereotypes by, writing something that was very deeply personal. So one person's sign said, "My Black trans life matters." Another person said, "Ice skating is beautiful," because his story was about how a family had taken him on his first vacation at the age of 17, and he got to go ice skating. And so they walked in and amongst the cars as we held flashlights on them. as their story was being played. And then, the audience, instead, since they couldn't applaud, they would like flash their lights, beep their horns. And then at the end of the show, they flipped their signs around and they all said, "We matter." And they walked through the crowd of cars together. And it was so powerful. So I would love to keep doing work like that. That's the kind of work you could support through either a donation or helping me find a grant or, connecting me with a community. I do a lot of work with teams. And it's sometimes people use my work the same way that they might like go to a ropes course and do a trust fall or, those kinds of opportunities. It's because of the authenticity, the truth, the vulnerability that we talked about. It's a way for people to know each other and then work together more efficaciously. So that's work that I would love to have more opportunities to do. And then individual coaching. I especially love working with people who are at a choice point, who want to use storytelling for that manifesting that we talked about, and also just how they gather their stories about, say it's a woman who wants to start her business and she wants to be able to talk about the experience that she's had eloquently and sort of sell that to other people.
Right.
So I love working with individuals, but I've worked with other storytellers who wanted to develop new material for a show that they were making. We talked about my website, storymuse.net. It's got some great case studies on there. And so any kind of stuff like that people have a vision for, please ring me up.
And also, you have some great videos of some of the projects that you've worked on in the past. And I do want to, as we're closing, put in a plug for actually a project that you're working on or will be working on with Zabin Parody Center, Stories About Home, where you'll be working with people who are experiencing homelessness and kind of that impact of what it means to really transition from a very traumatic experience to one full of hope, but all that lies in between. So super excited about that project.
I'm excited to work with you too again. I think one of the things that I should point out is that oftentimes when I'm making these shows, they are in some way like a fundraiser or a friend raiser for the organization.
Yes.
And by working with their clients or their staff or their board or some combination of those folks, then it's an opportunity for people to more deeply communicate their mission.
Exactly.
And to show, the real impact of work. And so even like when I did Trigger Warning, I had a grant that paid my time, paid the storytellers, rented the venue. And so I partnered with Men Stopping Violence so that could become a fundraiser, and there was no pressure on the ticket sales. Like it just, all the tickets were a fundraiser. And I love doing that model with people because it's sort of like this powerful double whammy of like, here's our mission and here's how you can support us all together in one beautiful evening.
It is. And, and again, it humanizes people because a lot of times when you think about the population served by a lot of the nonprofits, like you said, there's this story that goes with the community, and that story is not a positive one. Mm-hmm. And so we don't see people in the community as individuals. We lump them together and we forget that they all have their own unique story.
Yeah. I do want to call out that one of the things that I've been grappling with is that some of my fellow art makers in the social justice space are trying to help sort of revision how we do some of this work. Because we don't want to sort of have somebody be able to show up at a show, pay their ticket, listen to a story and feel like they've just been absolved, they've had this sort of voyeuristic experience.
Yes.
And I'm very conscious of the fact that some of my work could teeter on the edge of that. And so I'm trying to figure out how I can sort of make the work be, at least on a trajectory where people do, become more invested and do more work. And maybe we even challenge the audience to tell their stories to each other so that they don't feel like I'm just here for my own entertainment.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, for lack of a better word, I kind of hate to say this, but I have someone who works with me and they call it poverty porn, but it really is where you put people out there for a moment, let them tell their story or take a picture, and then it all drops away. And as a viewer, you feel like I've done my job.
Yeah, we call it in the disability work that I do inspiration porn. So I think that, you
Right.
know, there's a lot of variations on that theme, of people are really kind of tired of being the quote unquote poster child for this issue.
Right.
And
Right.
so I feel like it's going to be some of the work of my next few years to try to figure out how we, you know, we help people, you know, we hold up a mic to the stories that we need to hear, but we also,
Exactly.
you know, use that in a transformative way for everybody.
Exactly. Right. Shine a light on it, but just don't shine a light on it and it goes away. You know, how can we really turn this into a movement where we're really working towards ending some of these challenges and issues that our people, our neighbors are experiencing, our vulnerable neighbors.
Right.
So this has been great, Shannon. I so appreciate having you today. This has been awesome. Give everybody just one more time information about how they can reach you.
Absolutely. And Adrianne, it's always a pleasure. I think you're just like one of the most beautiful human beings inside and out I've ever known. And I always love supporting your work. So my information is, my website is storymuse.net. And then I'm on Facebook at StoryMuse, and Instagram, and that's story_muse. I have a YouTube channel, which you can find connected to from all of those sites. And then my LinkedIn is Shannon M. Turner.
Awesome. Thank you again, Shannon. It's been great. Thank you everyone for joining Onward on WCEG Network, WCEG talkradio.com. Have an awesome day, everyone.